Hello, everybody. John Barnwell here in Detroit with Reverend David William Parry in the merry old England city of London, sometimes merry. And we're here with our 70th episode of What is Truth? And as we get closer, it gets further and further away. But that's a good thing because it gives us something to do. And it's all about that, really, isn't it? It's the quest. The quest itself. It's not about getting there as so much as a continual state of becoming. And given the current situation in the world, there's many ways one could look at that and try to come up with some kind of a solution, so to speak. And really part of the problem that mankind has is that they keep trying to come up with solutions. And that's where the troubles begin. And I don't mean to sound cynical because I'm not, but it's quite an interesting quandary when you start to look into, I'm just setting up my references here. When you start to look at this and look deeper into it and try to come to some understanding about what is the truth of the situation, especially in the world where there's so much fabrication going on, representation. And given that we continually repeat the adage that art is higher than philosophy, perhaps now we could attempt to give you one of the central reasons why that would be so. And no easy challenge, but yet that's a central understanding that lives at the core of Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy or spiritual science. It's that while he deals with the depth of esotericism, nonetheless, the whole framing of anthroposophy is in the arts. And the Center for Anthroposophy at the Goetheanum, now we have the second Goetheanum because the first one was burned down, but one of the most remarkable artistic achievements by anybody, with a carved wood everywhere. I mean, I think we'd have to do justice by doing just an episode exploring that. And I didn't even know I was going to mention it today. So why don't we move on to some insights that we can glean when you come to understand. I'm going to give a brief quote that's very, very relevant today. It's from Lecture 14 of March 19th, 1922. It's in the lecture cycle that's published as Old and New Methods of Initiation. And I quote Rudolf Steiner, "Many reasons have led us to consider how the age of intellectualism, which we have often also called the age of the fifth post-Atlantean culture," which is our current age of the consciousness soul, begins in the transition from the 13th to the 14th and 15th centuries. In this age, human beings come to regard the intellect as the dominant factor in all their endeavors. We have often spoken of the way in which this intellectualism has come to develop in the various realms of inner life. Everything that is characteristic for human evolution has its more inward aspect through which it lives, more expressly in people's feelings, in their views, in their dominant will impulses, and so on. At the same time, it also has an outward aspect which manifests in the conditions and circumstances which arise historically in human evolution. In this connection, it has to be said that the most significant expression of this intellectualistic age so far has been the French Revolution, that great worldwide movement of the end of the 18th century. For long ages before it took place, much in the life of mankind pointed to ways of striving for the very kind of social community which then came to be expressed so tumultuously in this French Revolution. And since then, much has remained of this French Revolution. And since then, flickering into life here or there, in one form or another, in the external social conditions of mankind. Only consider that the French Revolution and the way it manifested at the end of the 18th century could not have been possible previously. For prior to those days, human beings did not seek full satisfaction on this earth with regard to everything they were striving for. You must understand that before the time of the French Revolution, there was never a period in the history of mankind when people expected everything human beings can strive for in thought, feeling, and will to find an external expression in earthly life. In the times which preceded the French Revolution, people knew that the earth can never provide for every single requirement of man's spirit, soul, and body. Human beings always felt that they had links with the spiritual world and that they expected this spiritual world to satisfy whatever requirements cannot be satisfied by the earthly world. And so that gives us kind of a starting point for our journey today. So, David, how are you?
Okay. Both I and my partner are somewhat under the weather today. I mean, I get osteoarthritis quite badly, and it tends to hit on a cycle. So this is my crushed period until the beginning of February. Yeah, and there's some sort of bug going on again in London. So yeah, okay. I can't say over the moon, but okay today. You said some very interesting things there. I mean, I was by accident I discovered some anti-anthroposophical people yesterday because I'm putting together an article. I was amazed at the level of hysteria. My understanding of anthroposophy is as a philosophical society. When is a cult not a cult? Well, darling, Karen, over here they're called Karen, so I can tell you. When it's actually abducting people and doing things against their will and forcing them into financial exchanges, that's when it is, which doesn't seem to ring true about the Anthroposophical Society as I'm experiencing it, or used to experience it. I always thought Americans, with due love and respect to everybody, always got the idea better than Europeans of a philosophical society, but maybe not. And it was the level of open, I mean, are the born agains that desperate to be? I mean, the answer is yes, isn't it? To be right about absolutely everything. Please give it a rest. You're impressing nobody. And by the way, the thought of spending eternity with people like you really isn't the selling point you might think it is. So yeah, the French Revolution. I know a tiny bit about these things. I used to, in a past life, teach the literature that led up to the French Revolution. French literature can be exquisite. I don't think it holds the cumulative power of English literature for one simple reason, and that's in the word cumulative. It's not for no reason that English literature is called the second great tradition, accompanying Greek philosophy as the first great tradition. It's the second great tradition because of its continuity. That doesn't mean there aren't exquisite things in French literature. There most certainly are. I mean, it struck my mind, I wasn't the only person, I'm not the only person back then, that you only really get the French Revolution because of the beheading of Charles I in England. A strange happening. I mean, there's something in the Anglican hymnal where they sing for Charles, saint and martyr. You must be kidding. He's a politician. The king is a politician. People with supreme executive power are still politicians. You must be kidding you. And I refuse to sing it. I mean, isn't that idolatry of some sort? But, you know, I mean, it's often misunderstood because you get warring factions in politics, as always, between the progressive Democrats and the more staid traditionalists. But in that particular time frame, it's really not clear who is who. And you get very similar competing opinions on both sides. It's a very strange one. You know, and people tend to forget the parliamentarians were going out of their way to make a deal with the king. You know, it wasn't, you know, right, we're on you, mate. You know, no, they had teams of lawyers, rather like nowadays, going out of their way to make an agreement with the man who was so personally so arrogant that he was walking to the gallows, telling them history would end, God would personally intervene. They'd all be condemned to death by his forces, and that would be the end of that. I mean, then of course, it happens. History didn't end. Yeah, there we are. Surprise, surprise. Angels didn't intervene. You're a politician, mate. You're a politician. You know, his forces who had been beaten didn't suddenly rally to the cause, although they did later, but that's a different issue. And there was I believe, if I'm recalling correctly, the executioner was an Irishman who holds up the head saying, "Behold the head of a traitor." In other words, a sovereign that lets his people down is actually a traitor. Therefore, that was the original, as far as I can discern, cataclysmic psychic happening. You know, in other words, it's not simply physical, it's psychophysical, because that is a shattering divide between the ancient world, the divine right of kings, when, you know, they're in a platonic line of being between us mere mortals and deity, in all of its unconditional glory. You know, and there we are. You know, ha ha ha, mate, you should have got your lawyers onto coming to a good deal with the parliamentarians. So without that, I don't think you actually get the French Revolution, which was too successful for its own good. I mean, yeah, I'm one of these people, you know, the sociologists, at least the ones in the past, weren't wrong about everything. You know, and there are such things as social forces, cultural forces, that manifest in particular ways profoundly at particular times. And that was, you know, the demos. Do we get the word demon from demos? I hope not, because ordinary people aren't demons, they're just ordinary people. Excuse me. The demos made its will heard. I mean, people tend to forget it was a bold, fearless primary expression of experimental European politics, and it went wrong. I mean, let's not forget that. I mean, the Reign of Terror, initiated by Robespierre, the head of the Jacobin Party. Without him, you actually don't get the revolution in the first place. But he was complicit very, very clearly in the Reign of Terror. You know, people going missing, everybody afraid to open their gobs the minute they got to the National Assembly. Oh my God, it's like Parliament nowadays. We're not quite that bad. And oh God, what was it? David, one of my favourite painters. What a gutless bastard, who always, a wonderful painter, but gutless bastard. You know, what was it when matters of politic started turning against Robespierre. He stood up in the assembly. If they come for you tomorrow, I'll be with you, Robespierre. Well, you weren't, were you? I mean, you didn't turn up the next day, and they turned up at your house. There we are. So what a crawler. They imprison him. And he does a portrait of himself as little Mr. Innocent Goody Two-Shoes, and it bloody worked. How did that happen? So he got off the hook, but of course Robespierre didn't. Yeah, I mean that it's almost a seismic turn. I can see why Steiner is making such a fuss of that. It's a seismic turn in human affairs. I mean, that is one of the turning points of history, because without that, you don't really get the other revolutions. You don't get the American War of Independence. You don't get the Russian Revolution. You don't get the Chinese War of not self-sufficiency. What's it called? Self-determination. And it's all from Charles I. I mean, what if he'd have made a deal? Would we all still be, yes, my lord, no, my lord? What if his lawyers had cut a deal at the last minute? Do you know, looking back, what a terrible thought that would have been. I'll just round off with this bit, John, because that's how I'm feeling today, thoughtful. I mean, it wasn't actually the French Revolution, of course, that put an end to this nonsensical feudal elite, which, of course, is smuggled back nowadays as the global 1%. That can dictate their terms on anything to anybody. My dear friend Cyrus Yavner, the film producer, had dealings with them, a director, and dealings with them at one point. Some woman didn't know the difference between $50 and $5 million. I can tell you the difference. Believe me. So that's the sort of people you're dealing with. But it was actually Napoleon, of course, that takes the French Revolution. They'd all managed to kill each other. All the revolutionaries had managed to kill each other. So there was no one to stop him. There was no one to stand against one of the last great warrior opportunists in European history. And he swept away all of the old mechanisms, most of the old aristocracy, most of the old ways of doing political business. I mean, he was some people think he's a leftist, of course. I don't know. I think he's one of those tour de forces in nature that's incredibly difficult to analyze. Certainly in European letters, if you're on the side of Napoleon, you tend to be viewed as a progressive, as a leftist, as someone open to radical change. And thereby hangs another tale, I think. But yeah, let's hear it for the French Revolution. I agree with it. I support it. Vive la France. That's what I say. God bless America. We need America. We need its constitution. We need anthroposophy. We need all of these wonderful innovations that are not simply antiques, that are not simply hangovers of an ancient world, looking and striving for better tomorrows and better ways of doing things, because it will be a sad day on humankind if we ever stop doing that. So that's roughly how I am today, John.
Yeah, well, I think that view of Napoleon being on the left, you have to understand, what do they mean by that? And people throw that word around, left, and they throw around the word liberal, and you don't really know the history of those terms. And when you say somebody's on the left, that's its primary references to the Estates General, and that was the structure, the parliamentarian equivocation of the French, essentially. And so you have the feudal system evolving into the parliamentarian system. And so you have the first estate is the church. The second estate is the king and the nobles. The third estate is the people, the commoners, the ones that weren't noble. But the nobles sat on the right side of the king, and the commoners sat on the left side. So to be on the left means that you were a commoner. And that Napoleon definitely was. He was a commoner, a brilliant one, nonetheless, showing that they had something going too. And it's an interesting journey to study all that history. You know, it brings to mind, there's this kind of an aristocracy of creativity too, in the realm of arts. And so the story I like to tell, and I've told it here before, but I think it's probably been 15 episodes ago, so I can run it by you again. But Goethe and Beethoven are taking a walk through the park, and they come across a company of aristocracy, and Goethe, being a part of that system, that he was under the Duchy of Weimar, he was a court official, and so as they came upon this group of aristocrats, Goethe bows down, and Beethoven stands there with his arms crossed. He's not going to bow. And Goethe afterwards asked him, what was that about? I don't know the exact statement, but it's something to the effect of what was that about? And Beethoven said, they should be bowing to us, which actually is true. I mean, the only thing that they have really accomplished is just being born in a particular family. Not to say that some of them hadn't achieved certain things, but that it's the point of that you gain a certain qualification in the caste system based on your birth. It's something that leads back to ancient India. And but as you go further back in history, you start to see the significance of a lot of these institutions and how they evolved. And in that quotation I read from Rudolf Steiner, he very clearly makes the point is that before the time of the French Revolution, it wouldn't have been thought of that you could strive to find satisfaction in thinking, feeling, and will, in spirit, soul, and body in this world. And then along comes the watchwords of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity, that are said to be attributed actually to the Comte de Saint-Germain. But these words keep getting reinterpreted, and they lose some of the substance of what it means. But let's see, here is Rudolf Steiner says, those individuals who demanded and worked for the realization of the three ideas, liberty, equality, and fraternity, as well as those who later followed in their footsteps, were able to dimly discern in which direction modern humanity's forces of evolution are pointing. But they have not been able to overcome their belief in the uniform state, so their ideas contain a contradictory element. Nevertheless, they remain faithful to the contradictory, for in the subconscious depths of their souls, the impulse towards the triformation of the social organism, in which the triplicity of their ideas can attain to a higher unity, continued to exert itself. The clearly discernible social facts of contemporary life demanded that the forces of evolution, which in modern mankind strive towards this triformation, be turned into a conscious will. So that there's this natural, innate tendency in man to look for a threefold process of evolution and of unfoldment. And you can go back in history, go back to Plotinus with the good, the true, and the beautiful. I mean, that whole type of thinking is reflected in Dionysius the Areopagite's representation of the 9 hierarchies, 3 groups of 3. And you get into the St. Paul's referring to a human being as a man of spirit, soul, and body. And you can just go wherever you want, you'll find that, and you get it in the Hegelian dialectic, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, which essentially is derived from Fichte. But so, what is that? And then you get into understanding these strivings, and while the French Revolution was happening, and when they decapitated the king, and that whole thing happened with Marie Antoinette, and going after all the nobles and all that, went into chaos. There were people that were supportive of that. There had to be some kind of change. You know, people like Wagner, people like Schiller, for example, and he's probably the best example of somebody other than Goethe. But Goethe himself, it was an innate tendency. He is an artistic soul. And it was through Schiller going into great despair and being brought to tears on being informed of what was occurring with Robespierre and all the action with the guillotine in Paris, and everything just totally chaos. And so that just led him into going deeper into it. And he wrote a series of letters to a nobleman, and they're classically referred to as on the aesthetic education of man. Über die ästhetische Erziehung des Menschen. And these letters embody something that was so profound that really it was these letters that gave Hegel the desire to crown Schiller as a philosopher. I mean, it was a breakthrough on his part, because he, again, up until his time, everybody was struggling with Immanuel Kant, and still afterwards, because Immanuel Kant basically defined the territory of modern philosophy and the limits of thought and all of that. And you had this, like, the extreme example in utilitarianism that manifested in England, where you have the enthronement of this intellectual tendency, and that they're going to be able to resolve it and create a state that is rational, you know, that follows the dictates of this intellectual trend, but it doesn't take into account the life of the spirit. And so that's its shortfall. And so what does Goethe come up with this artistically? In his Faust, he says, "Two souls, alas, dwell within my breast, and each will wrestle for the mastery there," right? And so, he says in the first part, "You're aware of only one unrest. Oh, never learn to know the other. Two souls, alas, are dwelling in my breast, and one is striving to forsake its brother. Unto the world in grossly loving zest, with clinging tendrils one adheres, the other rises forcibly in quest of rarefied ancestral spheres." So you have him artistically portraying this worldly struggle with the spiritual struggle. And as we move into the modern era, as people become intellectual, they gain the freedom to be able to deny the world of spirit and the world of soul. And so as a result of that, you have this abstract thinking that I many times is typified, that Rudolf Steiner is very clear when he says abstract thinking always leads to conflict. And this is why, because it doesn't have a provision for the world of spirit. And if you remember in a previous episode, I read a quotation of Steiner's where he says, he's describing the events leading up to World War I. And he says that this is inevitable, that the spiritual, the divine spiritual world cannot be denied. And if you deny it, you will go into chaos. Basically, I mean, I'm paraphrasing a whole paragraph, so I'm just not sitting here all day reading Steiner quotes, however relevant they may be. But it was really Schiller upon finding that Goethe was going back to re-edit his wonderful novel in 2 volumes here, and that's Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship and Travels. It's essentially in 2 volumes, although you can find that nice edition. That was published in, it's translated by Thomas Carlyle, and that's my favorite. But there's another edition that you can get in 6 volumes. And this is a nice set too. And what's part of what's nice about it is that it has interesting commentary. But that was done by H.M. Wadeson. But in these books, it's interesting because Wilhelm Meister is a guy he's like a traveler who's outside of society. He's not like, okay, I'm going to my father's business and just spend every day doing whatever trade. He's a guy who goes out and he's wandering in the world trying to find his way, and he ends up coming in contact with the Brotherhood, and it's just a fascinating thing. And I don't want to spoil the story for you, so I won't give you too many details, but it's that whole idea that this is a soul that's detached from the norms of society, that represents the ideal type, the artistic temperament, as we would call it. And so that led Schiller to write this series of letters on the aesthetic education of man. And then he ended up later expanding on them, and it's available as a book. And but in there, he encapsulates the basic concept, and it's so beautifully done. He says, man only plays when he is in the fullest sense of the word a human being. And he is only fully a human being when he plays. Now, by saying play, it doesn't mean just screwing around, but that engaged in creativity, in artful activity, being an artist. And so it's that striving, that mood of soul in which one is a creator being, is creating a work of art, whether creating the watercolors or writing a poem or composing music or writing literature, whatever art form, like pottery. I mean, in the East, in the Orient, in Japan, if you study a martial art, okay, that's yang. That's very, very much a kind of a masculine thing. But anybody who's seriously studying martial arts in Japan will also study a soft art form, like pottery, flower arranging, calligraphy. And so they see it as a balance. And that's an important point in which to understand, because when he's saying man only plays when he is in the fullest sense of the word a human being, he's pointing at that healthy harmony between these 2 strivings. Because you go back to the 2 souls, alas, dwell within my breast, that Goethe refers to, and you see that's that worldly striving and then the spiritual striving, and that the French Revolution, it's seen as like a departure from this harmonious rhythm between the spiritual striving and the earthly striving. And so when you get into that, and you can take it to another level, because within these letters, Schiller says, therefore, no error will ever be incurred if we seek the ideal of beauty on the same road on which we satisfy our play impulse. We can immediately understand why the ideal form of a Venus, a Juno, and an Apollo is to be sought not at Rome, but in Greece. If we contrast the Greek population delighting in the bloodless athletic contests of boxing, racing, and intellectual rivalry at Olympia, with the Roman people gloating over the agony of a gladiator, now the reason pronounces that the beautiful must not only be life and form, but a living form. That is beauty, inasmuch as it dictates to man the twofold law of absolute formality and absolute reality. Reason also utters the decision that man shall only play with beauty, and he shall only play with beauty. And so it's that whole idea of that in order for something to be true in the higher sense, it has to be aesthetically pleasing. And you know, you couldn't really describe the battles of the gladiators in the Colosseum as aesthetically pleasing by any stretch of the imagination. And so you have this kind of glorification of that worldly striving, because that's what you'd see the gladiators as in the modern sense. Whereas in the ancient world, you go farther back, like the Vikings, they wanted to go to Valhalla. So they were still acting in the context of their understanding of their relationship to the supersensible. And so it still existed at that time because man had not entered into the relationship with their ego to the point to where they felt themselves to be divorced from that reality.
Gosh, there's a huge amount there to respond to. In the same way, I can't really be on the side of the Jacobins. I also can't really be on the side of Rome. You know, the world's first military machine, they would turn up to a battle with our forebears and lose it and return and lose it and return and lose it and return and eventually win, which of course people tend to forget was seen as the height of immorality in the ancient world. It didn't allow the gods to speak. It didn't allow them to make a decision. It enforced domination. I mean, so things go wrong, I suspect, when ideologies get out of control and militaries get out of control. You know, the world's first military empire was Rome, and it was very ugly in all sorts of ways. A beautiful city built by ugly ideas, and there is no way around that. It was an unpleasant place. Oh gosh, certainly. I also think it's unwise to divorce Schiller's attitude to play completely from simple play. Certainly, he would have seen that sort of spontaneity and interacting with the cosmos as something elevating in itself. You know, a simple nonsense like peekaboo would have been something elevating to him because it's the delight of the moment between people sharing a moment. So that would have been humanizing and humane to Schiller. Someone who appears a lot in my dissertation on theatre, if ever it gets finished, because I think that voice needs to return. Very, as you were saying yourself, John, very misunderstood in all sorts of ways. And the depth, I mean, the essays they don't appear to be deep. Reading them, you know, it's sort of, and this happens and that happens. And then somebody said, but actually the depth is in the ideas themselves, not necessarily the technical presentation, of which there's very little in Schiller. Arguably. Oh gosh, I don't know. I just, left and right, we got to be cautious, but we also mustn't be afraid to admit ideas have, ideas like people, like books have lives. They're born at a particular place. They grow to maturation and they age. That is just what the human condition is like and what human beings do within that set of rules. So what was made by made about liberty, equality, and fraternity in the past may not be what we mean now. Certainly, it doesn't appear to be in the minds of so-called progressive nowadays. I mean, it's hard to know what it is that they want, apart from some sort of ill-defined social justice, which throws away the entire notion of history. Have we, there was something called the past, which we could do nothing about. There's something called the present, which we can do everything about. And there's something called the future, which we can create. But if, I don't know, it's in 1984, isn't it, where the party, they've done that. The party have got rid of history. They've got rid of everything into a demonic version of the eternal moment, where the party is always supreme. The party always wins arguments, and the party is always supreme, because they're doctoring. I mean, what people tend to miss about that, you mentioned it yourself a minute ago, the state of becoming, not being, but becoming, on its way to being. But that's the human condition as well. Only the angels are in a state of being. We are not. We're in a state of becoming. So that the party's struggling with all of this all of the time, but managing. I mean, there's a wonderful bit where Winston goes to a pub. It's many, many years since I've recalled it, so forgive the paraphrasing, and tries to talk to a pleb, an old pleb who remembers the world before. And he talks about a toff that isn't in the dictionaries of the party, so he doesn't know what he means. And how this guy had blooded his nose for saying something nasty. And Winston is utterly desperate, because he knows the knowledge of the world before is in that man, but the linguistics of the world before have been altered to such an extent, there's no way someone in Winston's present world that can really make sense of the ancient world. No, I mean, there are divine versions of the eternal present, there are demonic versions of the eternal present, and they tend to be when they're cut off from the sublime, when they're cut off from the celestial, when they're cut off from the spiritual. You actually said so much, I don't know where to go from there. I'll hand back to you, John, because you've got 1,000 things on my head at the minute.
Well, getting into this whole idea of intellectualism, because that's like really what we're experiencing right now is kind of the decadent end game of intellectual pursuit. Many of the things that have been created by mankind that are now come back to haunt him with all their bad side effects and so forth. You have to realize that most of them were created because some engineer or some scientist, he found it interesting, and that he could figure out something, and if I do this, this will happen, and before you know it, things created. All you have to do is look at Teller and the atom bomb. I mean, and the dismay that he showed in that classic photograph of him in Look magazine, where you could see he's absolutely devastated at the end game, resulting from his creativity. And so, as Rudolf Steiner says, this is the final consequence of intellectualism, which is gaining ground today in all realms of life. People begin by allowing their thoughts to become the dead inner content of their soul. How rigid, how dead are most thoughts which are produced these days? How little inner mobility they have? How much are they parroted from models created earlier on? There are extraordinarily few original thoughts in our present age. And so what he's getting at there, and later in this lecture, he goes into to talk about the meaningful content of anthroposophy, and that we must pay attention to the fact that human beings can find in anthroposophy a meaningful content for their lives if they turn with their healthy common sense to what can be won through imagination, inspiration, and intuition. By opening themselves to what could be discovered, for example, through imagination, they can recapture that inner vitality that will make them receptive to medicines, or it may be that they will also become free personalities who are not prone to succumb to all sorts of public suggestions. By entering in a living way into the truths revealed by inspiration, they can gain a sure sense for what is true or false, and they can become skillful in putting this sure sense into practice in the social sphere. And And by entering in a living way into the truths given by intuition, human beings can develop to a high degree something else which they need in their lives, a certain capacity to let go of their own selves, a kind of selflessness. Entering in a living way into the truths given by imagination, inspiration, and intuition, this gives human being a meaningful content in their lives. And then he goes on to point out Ralph Waldo Trine about how they only need to read the content of something in order to gain the content for their lives. And Rudolf Steiner says, it is more difficult to obtain a content for life in an anthroposophical way. For along this path, you have to work. You have to work in order to enter into a living way into what research reveals through imagination, inspiration, and intuition. But then it becomes a content for life, which unites intensely with the personality and with the whole human being. The secure life content is what is given by what wishes to enter the world as anthroposophy. So you see there's something that's on the one hand giving you a means to be able to approach things on a deeper level, but yet giving it to you in a very free way, and how anybody could characterize that as a cult, when essentially anthroposophy is what you could call an anti-cult. It's in that it doesn't have any of the earmarks, as you were describing, of what one would consider a cult. It's only a way of observing the world and a means for discerning, having a greater meta-narrative in which to frame one's thinking. And how that could be deemed as a cult it just shows you that these people, because of the type of intellect they're attempting to read Rudolf Steiner's work, they can't really penetrate into the spirit of it. And so it's just, they're approaching it with dead thoughts, and that's not good enough. You have to take these ideas in and live with them, and it becomes a part of you. And that's what's missing in people that are attempting to approach it in that way, and they get into the weird fundamentalist hinge, like it's some kind of devil worship or something. For us to spend most of our time trying to discern the significance of Jesus Christ, I don't know that I would describe that as devil worship.
Forgive me for being a little distracted. My partner looks rather ill at the minute. Well, I mean, it's that old chestnut Catholic. Are Catholics Christian? So, right, we talk about Jesus Christ. We talk about the Gospels. We sort of do our best, which is our worst, to try and live through the scriptures. I mean, there's something called a tradition as well. So, I mean, it's nonsensical. I mean, I've met some people in the flesh that way who had sort of Karen Jesus Christ Barbara as a surname. And you think, is that really honouring the Saviour, or does it show you're some sort of delusional personality? You're going through some sort of traumatic experience. Who is to blame? Who I blame always? The churches. The minute you put power and structure before the gospel, what is important? The gospel, not people's careers, not people dominating others, not being proved right at all costs. The gospel. And if you think you're right about the gospel at all costs, you haven't understood the gospel. So, yeah, I mean, I must admit what I heard was a little surprising. I won't say shocking, but surprising, because anthroposophy is so clearly a philosophical club, as opposed to anything else. When it was nearly laughable but I don't think these people get too many belly laughs, or indeed much sex, which might do them some good. So, oh gosh, John, yeah, I think right. How am I responding to this? I tend to react in a European way to words like intellectual and intellectualism. Intellectualism, I suppose, over here would tend to be a negative. I don't think intellectual would be a negative. I think that's sort of veering more into an American usage. I remember walking around. Oh gosh, not the Abbey. What was it? The Cathedral, Sir Christopher Wren's Cathedral. Name, right, the big one that everybody knows. And hearing a group of American tourists arguing with the tour guide about what the meaning of the word mystic, which of course over here means someone who's attaining visions of higher realities, but apparently in certain parts of America it means someone who's gone crazy. And so these arguments have broken out. The Wittgenstein in me loved it, between what does the word mystic actually mean, where he'd made the mistake of describing William Blake as a mystic, which he was, without sort of that American pragmatist interpretation. And there we are, the life of a word, the life of an idea, where in certain parts of America that word had come to mean something slightly other, like sort of some sort of, weird, obsessive, some sort of weird cranky person talking about pure abstractions. And I remember the argument ending St. Paul's Cathedral. Isn't that ridiculous? Whereas, the end game came with him, the tour guide saying, "Well, everyone respects the poetry," and that was sort of that brought to an end very unsuccessfully, I felt. And it's because, of course, the mysteries of language are making their own magic, are doing their own marvels. Certainly, the idea of being an intellectual, God, is that what an artist is? I mean, that's what I mean. You've got this explosion of thoughts in my head at the moment. Is an artist an intellectual? And I quite like some of the so-called leftist views of all of this. I like the phrase organic intellectual. In other words, it's somebody pursuing an inner vision and educates themselves in an appropriate way. I think that's a beautiful idea. Working on the basis that only the uneducated ever laugh at the self-educated. And really, what is it at the end of the day to be educated at a university? I mean, particularly with the way they are now, which seems to be an alternative belief system. Whatever happened to the notion of truth that says this is a show about truth? People can argue about truth with a capital T or a lowercase t. That is legitimate. To then take those arguments, I mean, I suppose the origin, at least in recent times, must be Heidegger, to take those arguments and permit a reductive type of materialism as your central point of reference, which is therefore a belief system. If you have a central point of reference, it is a belief system, not a search for anything anymore. And that dialectical materialism in all of its forms really is what the universities are talking about at the minute, especially in Europe. And they have a priesthood called the lecturers, who will discourage, downgrade, or completely ignore arguments which are legitimate outside of that system, and more often than not work better than arguments within that system, as ways of discussing the world. I mean, something I'm aware of at the minute. My partner is undertaking doctoral studies at King's College in London, which is very prestigious, and was told, you will do your research this way. And when asked why, was told, we know there are other ways of doing it, but we want it done this way. So, right, I mean, that's a priesthood taking people through their catechism. That isn't a group of scholars searching for the truth. That is not what it is. So when the born agains, I don't have much time for most of them, I'm sorry, because any group interested in browbeating being rude and being nasty to other groups doesn't really strike me as leading a Christian life. What is necessary is more self-reflection and humility. I'm right and you're wrong. That isn't humble. I'm sorry. You missed something there. And if you can't see that, then there really isn't much hope for your reading of the gospel. Which leads me to the other point. I mean, certainly the truths I've discovered in novels. I mean, Samuel Richardson, as an example, or dare I say, Lawrence Stern. Am I going to turn into someone like Lawrence Stern? Oh my God! If I live long enough, I bet that's what will happen. But David's version of Tristram Shandy was, which wouldn't be such a bad thing, would it? Yeah, I mean, in all of those very humane explorations of knowledge, there's never been the scientific hubris which tends to be founded on that type of reductive materialism, that can only really be interested in amoral problem solving. Yes, I've now created the world's greatest death machine. Aren't I clever? Which, I mean, and I don't go for this, oh, we're just scientists. No. It didn't work at Nuremberg, so why would it work anywhere else? We're just scientists. We don't worry about the moral factor. Then you're not human, let alone scientists. You people do know, the scientific community does know when it's becoming immoral. I'm avoiding the word amoral. There's no such thing as an amorality. I don't believe it. I think there are lots of people that would like other people to accept that, but no. My research is amoral. It just happens to be on torture chambers and how to improve them. No. The scientific community gets away with literally sometimes murder. It wants to do that because it's got a quasi-Gnostic attitude to information, which of course the Gnostics didn't share, simply accruing large amounts of information, which the Gnostics respected, was never simply their goal. They did that, but that was never the centerpiece, the central thrust of what they were about, because they were very aware of the dangers of that. And the modern scientific community has turned into this parody of a Gnostic priesthood, enforcing its way, when it gets the funding, which isn't often, enforcing its amoral discoveries onto the world around them. Therefore, you end up with monstrosities. I mean, Dr. Goebbels, let's have one of the old favorites, Dr. Goebbels and his creation of propaganda as a science now seems to me to be the way governments are acting. Oh, that was handy, that was useful. No, it's wrong, it's wicked, it's evil. What you're meant to do is say we're having nothing to do with any of that. Look at its point of origin and who was coming up with those ideas. Then you get a perspective of why we shouldn't be doing that. Anyway, you're looking concerned, John, so I'm handing back to you. I hope I haven't said anything too untoward. I think, what was it, Rabelais? Science without conscience is the ruin of the soul. And that has never been more true than nowadays. And particularly, maybe, I'll just say this one. In the weird and bloated information gathering of places like the Tavistock Institute, I am not a conspiracy theorist by any stretch of the imagination, although I'm open to certain conspiracies, financial conspiracies you can see in front of you. So I'm open to those ideas. Little groups in politics, yeah, I can sort of see how that works. Most of the more orchestrated conspiracy movements, I'll listen, but I'm not really convinced. However, and also we attack our institutions, we attack the universities, and I'm doing it at the minute far too readily, far too quickly, because they've got their own problems, they lack funding, and there are largely reasons why they're the way they are. But and also, but they can go wrong as well. And let's look at what the Tavistock Institute, as a point of fact, as a point of argument, tends to do. So it started as an institute searching for the secrets of the psyche, searching for the secrets of well-being on that mental plane, searching for new therapies, for new techniques that could get somebody functioning, not only individuals but communities. There's nothing wrong with social psychology. It's a valid discipline. Has ended up, and how do I know this? Because I know someone that studied there a couple of years ago, spying on its own students and gathering information. My dear friend, who was actually the head of a tutorial agency, therefore not a gullible teenager, suddenly noticed all the fire mechanisms, the fire, the things that start fire alarms in the building. There were too many of them, and she was sat there thinking, "Oh my God, does this mean this building is unsafe?" Which would be the natural reaction if there are that many fire alarms. Oh my God, I'm in the towering inferno. What could go wrong here? And she suddenly thought, oh no, my God, they're recording all these sessions. They're spying on us and recording it all. And she went to the director and said, "You're taping everything." And he said, "Well done. Not many people notice that. So aren't you meant to be apologizing for invading people's privacy?" So I don't know what happened to the end of that story. I never got up with the end of it. But that's where these things go horribly wrong. And the nanny state knows better. Nanny knows better than you. And if you end up saying anything or doing anything or thinking anything back to 1984 that nanny doesn't approve of, you'll be tortured and imprisoned. Handing back, John.
Yes, Tavistock. Well, I mean, all you have to do is, well, let's just do it. Let's just approach it geographically, okay? Tavistock Institute. Let's see, where is it located? Oh yeah, it's on land that was bequeathed to them from the estate of Lord Pirbright. Okay, well, who is that guy? Nobody's ever heard of that guy, Pirbright. Well, maybe you've heard of the Pirbright Institute and their relation to current events and holding the patent on the central problem in modern history. And then you look at it and say, well, Henry de Worms, that's who Lord Pirbright is. He's on both his father and mother's side, he was a Rothschild. But he left Judaism and converted to Anglican. And he was a central player in the power structure, along with Lord Rosebery, who married Hannah de Rothschild. And she was the wealthiest woman in the world next to the Tsarina at that time. And so it was those two individuals that perpetrated most of the scenarios that the Rothschilds get blamed for. I have the 2-volume biography of Lord Rosebery, and he was a very eloquent Scot. But if you read his autobiography, there's no mention whatsoever of the Imperial Press Conference of 1909, that he was the keynote speaker, in which they brought together journalists from all over the empire. At the time, in fact, Lord Rosebery was the prime minister for a very short period of time, and he was tied into that. I don't want to get into describing his fall. Maybe we'll do an episode about these characters, but that's the roots of what you're talking about, and so it goes back to actually the concept of government by journalism, which is like, how bizarre is that? Well, the Imperial Press Conference was financed by the Burroughs Wellcome Chemical Company, and they're now known as GlaxoSmithKline. But so you have this whole idea of this corporatism, this oligarchic hold on society, and that's that truncated humanity. That's that negation of the spiritual realm. They tend to grab all the buzzwords of the goodness that the proletariat will warm up to, but they don't follow through on it. They just use it as a political platform, and centralization is always a problem. People are not evolved enough to be able to have any kind of centralized government, regardless of what Leo Zagami might think about the reappearance of the king. He seems to think that we're going to go that the answer is in reassertion of feudalism, which I thought that kind of caught me by surprise when I hooked him up to speak with Tommy. But he's entitled to his own views. Somebody was at Agatha Velva was asking, what's the next shift after the French Revolution? One Steiner mentioned. Well, the next one would be 1879 November, with the War in Heaven culminating with Michael driving the spirits of darkness down to earth. And so now we got to deal with them, human individuals that embody these dark spirits, all your nefarious characters that there's no shortage of in the headlines today. And so it's up to us to be able to come to terms with that. And the next one after that, of course, is the ending of Kali Yuga in 1899. It began with the Krishna leaving the world, and then it ended in 1899. And so that's that lesser Kali Yuga, age of darkness, the Iron Age of Kali Yuga. And so we're moving into a new vista in which we can start to develop our relationship to the worlds of light. But like what I've said on numerous occasions, that in the age before the age of Michael, which started in November 1879, was the age of Gabriel. That's the age of blood ties and familial relations and secret associations and all these things that are starting to break down, because it's a challenge for somebody to truly become an individual and approach the spiritual world. And Rudolf Steiner, if you remember, I said before that Gabriel created a metamorphosis of the brain, the actual metamorphosis of brain structure over the 350 or so years of his rulership, so that it had an innate capacity to be able to embrace spiritual thinking, to approach the supersensible, right? And Rudolf Steiner is very clear. He says everybody has this, and you could compare. If you could go back and look at bodies from hundreds of years ago, you could find the change in the convolutions of the frontal lobe. He says, but if we don't use it, it will atrophy. And so as we move into the future, that you have that image of Michael with his sword, and he's fighting back the dragon. That's the dragon of the three demon manifestations of thinking, feeling, and will. And he's beating back that dragon. That's that lower nature. Like Goethe says, two souls dwell within my breast. Well, that's the lower one. And the higher one, and he's holding the scales frequently, right? And the higher one is like in the Papyrus of Ani in Egypt, where you have that the Anubis is there with the judgment of the soul, and there's the scale, and there's the heart, the Ib, as it's called in ancient Egypt, being weighed against an ostrich feather that represents Ma'at, the goddess of truth. And that if the heart has to be light, meaning that its conscience, it's clear, even though they really didn't have conscience, that it was more seen as as described in the Greek dramas of being assaulted by the Furies, that there was an actual relationship to the astral world. Well, we don't have that now. It's very rare for people to be walking around and having developed astral clairvoyance without going through the training. Although there are people that are imbalanced that are seeing lower realms of the astral, there is the pathological manifestation of that. But that being said, Rudolf Steiner is very clear. In order to get to the spiritual world, you have to go through the astral world. And so there's lower levels of the astral world that aren't real nice. And what's not nice about them? It's you. It's what you've done. And so the demons that you meet at the doorway are you. They're raying back your deeds and your thinking, your feeling and will, where you fall short of these high level aspirations, and so it's we have to stop putting it on other people. The more we can purify ourselves and bring ourselves through what is called catharsis, because it's through catharsis that one develops manas, or the higher mind, the spirit self, which is what we're supposed to be working on right now if we're attempting to evolve spiritually. And so in doing that, like Rudolf Steiner, for example, mentions the philosophy of freedom. Well, his book, The Philosophy of Freedom, is really a response to Schiller's aesthetic letters of education. I mean, most people don't even realize that, but if you get into it and you get into actually many years ago, I don't know, 45 years ago or something like that, 50 years ago, I lose track. We published an edition of Goethe's Secret Revelation, and that was the first cycle of lectures that Rudolf Steiner gave, and he was talking about the esoteric content of Goethe's literary works, where he talks about Faust, and he talks about the fairy tale of the beautiful lily and the green snake. And so there's an archetypal representation of these initiatory challenges. And so this is something that I've wrestled with for a long time. And in fact, instead of going out partying on New Year's Eve, I would read Carlyle's translation of the fairy tale of the green snake and the beautiful lily, and that would be my New Year's experience. And it's nice because to have these archetypal images, even if you don't achieve initiation in this life, at least you develop pictures into your astral etheric organization, so that hopefully in future incarnations you'll have the innate capacity to be able to approach those types of ideas. And so that's a beautiful thing. Well, I don't want to forget, because sometimes I do forget things, like the other day I made mention of the Blessed Virgin series, the Notre Dame series of cathedrals, as being in the constellation of the Great Bear. I was wrong in that. It's the constellation of the Virgin, of course, And so they create a map of the constellation of Virgo on a map. And then there's also the Great Bear was actually a series of monasteries for men, so I cleared it up here. I also mentioned it in that show I did with Douglas the other day, because it disturbs me when I make mistakes, but I make them nonetheless, In fact, I referred to the monasteries as being Dominican. They were Benedictine, they weren't Dominican. Yeah.
As far as I remember, even under the new dominion of social media, to err is human. You're a wonderful human being, John. If any of our listeners or watchers are being bastards enough to point that out, they've got me to deal with. We cover a lot of ground in these shows, and you're not, no one should be expected to be like a computer in that particular way. I mean, that's exactly what this show is standing against. Anyway, I'll hand it back.
Well, and that's true, actually, and in a way, this is there's a bit of gamesmanship here, because I didn't tell David that I was going to talk about Schiller today, but I wasn't particularly worried because I knew he'd be familiar with the territory, you see? Now, I mean, imagine if I started talking about American football and really come, he wouldn't have a whole lot to say about that, which is well and good. But I don't know if people always realize the depth of Reverend David here. That's part of his charm. Old Friar Tuck is that he's a member of the Royal Asiatic Society in good standing by their choice, and is known a great many people. And there's a reason why he's here, because there's not many people I can talk about many things and have them say something meaningful. But that being said, let's go back to this here, what I was about to do. So, Reverend David is an author, and he has 3 books. The first one is a Shakespearean study, A Haunting Conceit, according to Ian Sinclair, the writer and filmmaker, The Grammar of Witchcraft. And no, it's not a how-to book on doing magic spells. It's a Shakespearean study. And you have Caliban's Redemption, is Shakespearean-esque poetry, and that's kind of looks like David, but it's not. And that's wonderful. And then his major work is Mount Athos Inside Me, Essays on Religion, Swedenborg and the Arts, edited by Daniela Hadi Irandust, very talented young fellow. And those books are available on Amazon, and I highly recommend them. And as for myself, I have 2 works. My first book is The Arcana of the Grail Angel, the Spiritual Science of the Holy Blood and of the Holy Grail, with text and diagrams. It has a foreword by my best buddy, Douglas Gabriel from American Intelligence Media. It's a Spiritual Science of the Holy Blood and of the Holy Grail, a study developed out of the work of Rudolf Steiner of the underground streams of esoteric Christianity, which flowed from the Brotherhood of the Holy Grail to the Order of the Knights Templar and the True Rosicrucian Order. And all of the diagrams are reproduced in my second volume, plus I added a great many more. And this gives you the memory theater of spiritual science, so that you can keep the concepts that we've been sharing here organized, so that you can come to a closer relationship after the manner of the Gospel of Mark, the cosmic understanding. But this second volume is more of a meditative tool, and these are both available in the continental US on eBay directly from me. If you're outside the continental US, then you can contact me through private message on Facebook or through the academia link that's listed below. And there's links for all these books on YouTube down below. Plus, I put in some links for some of the lectures and references that I've given today, so that you can read the Steiner lectures, or you can listen. I put the audio and the text version, so I thought that would be helpful for some people. And but that being said, this is very therapeutic for me to be able to have these wonderful conversations. And I have to reiterate, we don't plan these out, so we're just winging it here, and that keeps it from getting too stale if we were just like doing all cribbing notes. Although I do apologize for reading a bit over much, but it was so potent what I was reading that I felt I had to share it because of the times in which we're living. And so much of what we need is what Schiller had to offer. What a soul he was. You know, and he rarely gets mentioned, except the Schiller Institute. They co-opted him because he was very liberal in his thinking, but I don't think that if Schiller were alive today, he would be a socialist. That I don't think. And so I don't lionize FDR. I think he's just another power broker as far as I could see. And so I'm in disagreement with them on some of those points, but that's okay. Again, we have the Estates General that we're still struggling with. But it's important to keep in mind that Schiller wrote the Letters on Aesthetic Education in seeing that in Europe they failed to accomplish what had been accomplished in the United States with our constitutional government. Now, like Benjamin Franklin, when he was coming out of the Continental Congress, the woman asked him, "What are you gentlemen doing in there?" He said, we've given you a republic if you could keep it. And of course, I merely paraphrased that. So we'll see if that's the reality in which we're living. But I think at this point, I want to turn it over to the Reverend Bishop David William Parry so he can consecrate our humble endeavor here with some form of prayer.
There's so much to say after that. I'll keep it brief. I suppose I'm so, who am I attacking all the time in Christianity? I suppose myself. I'm some sort of frustrated experimental Pentecostal that just doesn't happen to have many relationships with the Pentecostal church. I'm also a renewed member of the Anthroposophical Society, which is a wonderful thing. They're already supporting me with some artistic projects, not hugely, but a little, and every little helps. And their belief in the arts and the betterment of the human condition through the arts is astonishing. And I want to thank the Anthroposophical Society of Great Britain. It's just come to mind very, very deeply for the interest that they've taken in my work and the support they're giving, and the fact that we might want to stage some. I'm writing also a one-man drama on Beowulf, and they're interested in it being staged in the theatre. Yada yada. I can't quite think of anything like the Anthroposophical Society, and that's not to the detriment of the others I was a one-time member of. They all had their benefits and beauties and blessings, but there's something special about the AS and its belief in humanity and its belief in real knowledge, not just information gathering or Gnostic abstraction. There's something beautiful in its balance, in its form of white magic, and why not? Let's say it. Gosh, I mean, I never know how to round these shows up with a prayer. And also, I'm flabbergasted that Leo wants a new type of feudalism. Wasn't the first time bad enough? I mean, it didn't work. That's the whole point. If it had worked, you wouldn't have had all these burghers but coming together and telling the feudal landlords to sod off. That's the whole point. It wasn't working. So we go back to a system that hasn't worked in the first place. That won't get anywhere. And as for French politics, yeah, I think we are all still in that. We're all sat by the side of the king in various shapes and sizes, and the king still isn't willing to be accommodating, which is depressing. God.
Drew Rajput, he says FDR has connections to the Astor bloodline. Well, yeah, so do I. It's like, so what? I have both bloodlines, the Roosevelt bloodline and the Astor bloodline. It's like we have to get past this bloodline thing. And but that being said, back to David.
Oh no, that needed being said. That was a good interjection. I mean, again, as I said before, the minute it comes to American politics, Reverend Dave clams up because, like every other foreigner, I know the veneer, I know how it looks, but how something looks isn't always the way it is. So I tend to shut up, even with American politics, because it's close to us in some ways, but really, really not in others. It's a universe of difference in its intentions, in its activities. I'll just say one thing: we mere Europeans didn't manage to come up with a constitutional democracy. Why so many modern Americans don't understand the staggering and monumental achievement that was and that it is, I don't know. Um, I live in awe of the time that was written. I pray for a time that we have a written constitution in Britain. It's not coming anytime soon. And to be willing to throw out that baby with that particular bathwater is foolhardy and reckless beyond belief. And maybe people need to over there, over the other side of the pond, need to meditate, John.
Well, it's not a constitutional democracy. It's a constitutional republic,
Forgive me. Forgive me.
a democratic way of electing its representatives. And see, that's an important consideration, because incorporating the whole idea of the republic, but yet having checks and balances. See, that was the thing. And if you go to the 10th letter of the Federalist Papers, and Madison's in there, and he says, we've managed to, and I'm paraphrasing, he says, we managed to take care of most of the problems of government through checks and balances, but there's one thing that we couldn't really guard against, and that's factions. And by that, you could call that lobbyists, political groups, NGOs, all the bugaboos that are giving us so many problems today. But that being said, at least in the UK, you still have an intact system of common law. See, people here don't understand that common law it's out the window, basically. I mean, we really don't have a true representative system of common law like we used to have, And so these things are complex, and we're trying to work through them. But in my mind, the key working through them is to be able to develop your spiritual life, because it's the inevitability of conflict that arises when you ignore the spiritual world.
I stand thankfully corrected on that one. As I say, I'm feeling my way in American politics, and that's very interesting indeed. Certainly what holds untoward forces or people acting in an untoward fashion back here is the common law system. And we lose that at our peril. Certainly, a lot of the more draconian decisions that were made recently had to rely on maritime law in Britain because they couldn't have been got through in common law, which people have, God, how long has this problem been going on? They're only just pointing it out now, and that can't continue forever. You can't suddenly forget common law forever because it snaps back into the system. That's the important contribution of something like common law. Anyway, I notice we're very, very at that time. My friends, I'll make a fun prayer. Believe it or not, you can have fun prayers. Prayers can do all sorts of things. You can pray for people. You can pray for events. You can pray for blessings. You can pray against events and eventualities. You can also pray for fun because we're talking to a loving Father, the creator of us all, not a strict Latin headmaster, a Latinist teacher that's just looking for us to make mistakes and will send us to detention the minute we make enough of them. That is not, images of God. Is it the Latin master looking for mistakes, or is it the modern version of a gym mistress putting us through our paces? Oh, no, neither. We're looking at a divine creator and a divine source, from which we all came and to which we're all returned. Therefore, I'm going to give what started as a Scottish prayer and turned into a rhyme and a limerick. My friends, from ghosties and ghoulies and long-leggedy beasties and things that go bump in the night, good Lord, deliver us. And on that note, thank you, John, for another lovely discussion. You haven't unmuted. You haven't unmuted.
You could have told me sooner. Okay. Anyways, yeah, I also want to share that this podcast has been made possible by the generous support of some wonderful people: Tyla, Vadim, and Christian, Mark/Maud, Vivian, Druvman, Laura, Paula, Rick, and so many others over the years. I want to thank you all. And sometimes I forget to be conscious enough to give credit where credit is due. And so with that being said, I give all credit to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and I leave it up to you to figure out the rest. Thank you all very much.